Caner Hocam, we can start if you want.
Sure, please. Would you like me to make the introduction first?
That'd be great.
Okay. Hi everyone. I am Caner Bakır, professor of politics in International Relations Department. I would like to welcome you all for this wonderful event, and I should thank Merih, Angın for initiating this wonderful series, and also I would like to thank Jack Loveridge, who is also a GLODEM associate, for participating in this event. I would like to take very brief moment for talking or introducing our Center for Globalization, Research on Globalization, Peace and Democratic Governance. It is an academic and policy-oriented research center, and it was established in September 2004 as an informal faculty network, and it aimed to focus on globalization's impact on dynamics and development of national and international political and economic interactions. And GLODEM became a formal organization in 2010, and its expertise is on globalization and political economy, peace and conflict resolution, and democratic governance and administration. GLODEM is a partner with a number of well-known international organizations and forums. It primarily focuses on research-based academic activities leading to publications, including book publications as well as journal special issues. And the most recent one was organized in collaboration with Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis and International Comparative Policy Analysis Forum and Scholarly Society in September this year, leading to a special issue on Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. And the participants were from 7 different countries, including the former and current editors of the leading public policy and public administration journals, such as Robert Cox, Gilberto Capano, and Paul Kearney. So without further ado, I again thank Merih and Jack and all of you, and I'll leave the floor to Merih. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caner Hocam, for both the introduction and also for organizing the seminar series with us. It is a great honor to be organizing it with GLODEM for us. So we actually have an excellent presentation seminar today that marks the debut of the AI and CSS seminar series. We have Dr. Jack Loveridge with us, who is a historian of science and technology and is also the co-founder of the Digital Rights Society initiative. Jack completed his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin in 2017, and he also holds an MPhil in International Development from the University of Oxford. His work centers on the role of scientific research and technological innovation play in economic development, emphasizing how states and corporations conceptualize and govern human populations and environment. Focusing on South Asia in the era of decolonization, his recent publications have examined food security, population control, and rural development in North India during the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Dr. Loveridge was also a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. This is also where we met with Jack. We were in the same cohort between 2018 and 2019. And he also lectured at the Cooper Union during 2017 and 18. He also held a dissertation fellowship at Yale's International Security Studies program in 2016 and 17, and also a Fulbright Nehru doctoral research fellowship at the University of Delhi in 2014 and 15. So Jack is actually an excellent speaker for the start of our seminar series, which is aiming to bring together practitioners and academics working on AI governance as well as computational social sciences, because Jack happens to be both an academic and a practitioner. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Jack. If you have any questions, if you could note them down in the chat box, we will be asking them in the Q&A session. So I'll mute myself now, Jack.
Thank you, Merih. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And thank you, General Hojam, for hosting and for announcing the launch of this series. And I hope it's a good launch that begins with questioning some first assumptions around AI, its application, and some concepts within algorithmic governance. I'd also like to thank the Center, GLODEM, more generally. I appreciate the affiliation this academic year, and it's turning out to be a very productive one. So without further ado, I suppose I'll begin by simply saying any political opinions I might express today, just like you see on Twitter, retweets don't necessarily mean endorsements, and any political opinions I may express are not any way associated with any institution other than mine or my own. It's of course a very interesting moment to be speaking with you all, given the situation in the United States. It is something like an elephant in the room. It would be difficult to ignore. I've spent a good deal of time over the past 48 hours on Twitter. So just looking at how things are unfolding. So I feel like I have some very recent firsthand experience with the extent to which algorithms can influence the information we get, and also how they might well influence democratic outcomes. And I'd like to reserve a little bit of time as well in the discussion if anybody would like to talk about the election in the United States. I'm sure everybody is tired of hearing about it. I am too. But if that is something that's of interest, please feel free to ask any questions from, what does the voter turnout in Maricopa County, Arizona look like, to is the vote in Wisconsin secure? Those sorts of things I can field as well. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my presentation now, and if you could just let me know if it's visible once I've shared my screen. Thank you. So the title of the talk is Misgoverned, and that's not to assume that we can see a future ahead that is one of misgovernance, but one that will explore the ways in which algorithmic tools, AI more popularly called, can be used and abused. The idea is simply to look at how old power, and I'm using the term old power as a historian would, in a very broad sense, to simply mean ensconced economic or institutional power. What is it about this sort of power that loves or likes new tech, new technologies? Throughout history, we have examples of states and businesses in the 19th and 20th centuries in particular using novel technologies to solidify their bases of power and to further ensconce themselves, which seems often to be contrary to the ideals of the Enlightenment, which may well be undermining the principles of liberal democracy. And so in that context, I would like to begin. So why does old power like new tech? Well, the simple answer may well be, it's about the money, it's about gain, it's about the fortunes to be made off of investment and profit from novel technologies. But I would like to submit that it's something a little more complicated than that. it's not simply about material gain, but it is about power itself. It's about the protection of power in systems of governance. We have a wide range of very large and famous Silicon Valley-based, largely tech companies today, ranging from Facebook and Instagram to Twitter and YouTube and Google. And all of them seem to have this a relationship that is very difficult to define with Washington, D.C. in particular. And I'm using the context of the United States simply because it's something that's at hand. Recently in the news, we've seen the leaders of a number of these companies come before the Congress of the United States to testify regarding how they are using technology and how information is being spread upon their platforms. More recently, TikTok has faced opposition from the federal government of the United States. Some of its very well-defined critiques of the Chinese platform. Other critiques of it might not be particularly well stated, but it just depends on what those political interests might well be. A number of these companies, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, and Amazon in particular, are increasingly deploying a broadly defined range of tools that are deriving their power essentially from AI, from novel technologies that can take and sort great amounts of data and apply them to practical problems. Now, below that level of the popular, well-known corporations, we have a large suite of rising AI-focused startup companies. And many of these are very heavily capitalized companies. So it just demonstrates the breadth of this kind of industry and the different sectors that AI is touching right now. So again, it's something that is perhaps becoming more popular from a financial standpoint as well. It is a good place to put your money if you're an investor. And the yield or the return has not yet been seen, but we can see how power flows this way in terms of influencing these outcomes, this kind of a broad listing of many different practical applications for AI tools. Just to think a little bit more concretely about the profits of some of these companies, in the wake of the pandemic alone, this demonstrates, I think, pretty clearly how companies that have bet big on data and bet big on big data in particular have been able to thrive since March, since the shutdown in the United States, and since closures across Europe and the rest of the world. This would seem to be something of a phenomenon that's easy to explain. Amazon, of course, is making a great deal of money because of its base. It's distributing goods. When it comes to Google and Facebook, it's a little more difficult to understand. And it has to do with market behaviors. It has to do with broader investments and where those investments find their homes during periods of uncertainty. But investors have generally concluded that while there are some complications to betting on big tech is the way to go. It is the wave of the future. And so as a historian, I find that to be an incredibly interesting shift in how the global economy is situated. And given the broader implications of an economy that is seeing significant changes in how different classes are able to find employment. This is the kind of future of work material that is often discussed. We are perhaps at a very important intersection in time in how people work, in how people are governed, and in how people think about themselves in relation to their broader societies. So I borrow from Hannay and McGinn a science, technology, and society framework for thinking of technology, not just as a material thing or as an algorithm or as a suite of algorithms, but rather as a whole bundle of knowledge and methodologies that form procedural systems. So you're thinking of technology not simply as the item or thing or idea itself, but its context in relation to a broader society. That includes financial relationships, that includes racial relations, that includes gender dynamics. So having a broader and holistic sense of what technology is, I think, is very useful for this particular kind of starting point, where you're thinking about the assumptions that govern these technologies, you're thinking about the information that is going into them, and why that particular information is collected by organizations, by companies, by governments themselves. And I would note that the definition covers the idea that it is in a particular time, in a particular society. So that doesn't imply a one-size-fits-all solution or a one-size-fits-all kind of consideration, but it is contingent instead upon where we are in time and space. So one context for a particular technology would vary quite widely, or implications would vary quite widely from context to context. Within the thinking, at least at a popular level, regarding the pace of technological change globally, we have this idea of techno exponentialism. Some of you may be well familiar, of course, with Moore's law, the idea of increasing technological capacity at the level of the microchip, so that eventually you're approaching a point where computers or computing technology more broadly will reach a singularity, and where you will ultimately, and this is in the sort of more science fiction indulgent side of thinking about these topics, reach that singularity and you'll have technology making technology autonomously. And so it's that kind of future that seems to dominate a number of the ethical discussions surrounding these platforms. It is not to say that that is not a worthwhile discussion, but it would also seemingly forget that we are operating within a broader historical context. So we have a given framework to work with already. And it would be important, I think, to look at the past and look at current relationships to understand the future a bit better, and certainly to understand where we are today. So rather than thinking about technology as something that is becoming more and more of a dominant force in life, and it's this inexorable thing that cannot be addressed or encountered in any way, we're basically just riding a tiger into the future. We need to think about it in terms of human relationships, existing class structures, existing gender dynamics and racial relationships, and at the level of international coordination or dialogue, that kind of great power play that you see between China and Russia and the United States, it too has its broader history that cannot be forgotten and needs to be focused on. So techno exponentialism, as I'm calling it here, is a concept that has also spurred a great deal of popular literature, some of it incredibly good and thought-provoking. Not to counter that in any way. We have the fourth industrial revolution, famously from Klaus Schwab, which has inspired a great deal of dialogue at the World Economic Forum. Homo Deus, Yuval Noah Harari, another historian, a much more notable historian, of course, who works on these issues and has a fairly, I would say, pessimistic view of the potential of these technologies when it comes to ordering societies and when it comes to governing societies more broadly. There are concerns that Harari has voiced regarding the potential for artificial intelligence and for algorithmic governance more broadly to automate to the point that democracy itself, democratic institutions, are thoroughly at risk. And again, I would say that that is a very, very excellent critique, and it's worth further engagement and analysis. But I would push it a little further and say there's a need to look at the concentration of power that is involved in the deployment of these technologies. Who's doing the deploying of them? What are the purposes? What is the context? So just to add on a little bit to Harare's analysis. And of course, we have Newman and Blanchard, Human Machine. You see the titles are generally about this speculative integration of humans and technology, where we're becoming more and more fused and certainly more and more watched by the technologies that we are deploying and creating. And Everyday Chaos, of course, yet another work that has this concept of humans and tech becoming further and further integrated to mixed results. I would argue simply that, before I move on, I would argue simply that we are tech. We are already there. Tech is us. Technology is something that we have produced, and we've defined the terms. We don't have to have the sensation that we're riding the tiger into the future and we can't control outcomes. By focusing a little more in a dedicated fashion upon first assumptions, upon social relations, I think we can get a hold of that wild ride and perhaps have a slightly less dystopian or wildly utopian future ahead of us. And then most recently, the Center for Humane Technology, Tristan Harris, has made some waves on Netflix with The Social Dilemma, which is a very interesting documentary, incredibly thought-provoking. Here again, we're thinking about how tech companies, particularly Silicon Valley tech companies, use and deploy technologies that are, let's face it, somewhat addictive, very difficult to get away from these technologies once you get on them, and the different ways in which tech companies have, by design, encouraged the development of social platforms that prompt little bursts of dopamine. You have to check your notifications. You have a broad integration of different technological platforms and suites that enable a very deep tracking and a wide collection of data from users. And it's been noted by Harris, Tristan Harris and others based in Silicon Valley, who are this budding cohort of tech critics that Silicon Valley calls its customers users, which is something that previous industries have used to describe smokers, tobacco smokers. So he's emphasizing this addictive quality of these technologies. And I think that, again, there is a great deal to be learned from that kind of analysis. But we need to be a little more critical in putting the entire debate into somewhat more of a historical context. So in an effort to do that, in a very first halting effort to do that, and hopefully map out some ethical considerations in algorithmic governance and how we apply AI technologies, I think a good starting point is to think of power and what we mean by old power and new power, or what I mean by old power and new power in the title. I mean explicitly with old power, existing power, institutional power, whether it's by wealth or by economic status or gain. I'm talking about power that already exists, and its resistance to new power, that is the diffusion of power through a society, so that there are fewer and fewer concentrations of this kind of economic or political power. Again, very broad strokes. For most social scientists, we're in a sort of a level of impressionism right now. So to continue along that Manet or Monet path, we'll bring in a little bit of art. Here we have Charles II, of course. So we're thinking now about old institutional power, the trappings of the state. This is the world of Hobbes and ultimately Locke and Rousseau, thinking about social contracts ultimately. This is perhaps the broadest sweep I could possibly give of the Enlightenment. But this is the institutional power that we've inherited. as societies, Western, Eastern, North, and South. This is the kind of conception of power concentrated in an individual represented by the trappings of governance that we have to contend with. We're still working with this history. And the idea that we have somehow transcended this world of sun kings is a little, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's consider the broader trajectory. This power translates here in the 19th century into wonderful figures like J.P. Morgan, of course, who has this very compelling scowl on his face. If you look at this man, you see power incarnate. So there's this transition from the old state power of the 18th century and behind it to industrial power. The modern day incarnation, perhaps, of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller is Mark Zuckerberg, is Jack Dorsey, is Bill Gates. Power that is beginning to rival that of states, is beginning to have enough pull to set international agendas in the context of the Gates Foundation, for instance, to determine many laudable and important economic development and public health projects all across the global South in particular. But reminding ourselves the distance between this level of power and your conventional run-of-the-mill everyday millionaire. How did we get from here to here? Is power changing, or is it just wearing different clothing? Has it gone from the finery of dining wear, of dinner wear, to a t-shirt and shorts? I think over the past 10, 15 years, we've answered that question pretty thoroughly. This is an incredibly powerful individual, and we need to think of him as such, not to defer to that power, but to think about how to get some of that power back, perhaps. Again, referencing the recent hearings in the Congress of the United States, bringing Sheryl Sandberg representing Facebook and Jack Dorsey representing Twitter before a House Select Committee investigating how these companies might, in fact, like their predecessors of the Gilded Age in the United States, their Victorian predecessors, have monopolies, meaning having an excessive control over the market in all aspects of production from start to finish, basically being able to set their own prices. So this is a debate that's going on right now in the United States, and very strangely, it's seemingly not politicized yet, or at least politicized in the red and blue sense, where there's a ready-made answer for Republicans and a ready-made answer for Democrats. I think that Congress, and I think that the American political scene in particular, recognizes that these are very different kinds of power than the older amalgamations of power under large entities like General Electric or the Ford Motor Company. We've entered into a new age because of that interaction between what these companies do and political processes themselves. They can set not only agendas in terms of how money is spent and where resources are allocated, they can help to determine elections. They can help to determine outcomes within political processes. And so you see this very delicate dance on both sides of the aisle in Washington, D.C., trying to understand exactly how to get along with this new center of power based out on the West Coast of the United States, but running as well through Lower Manhattan in New York in the form of financial services. So what are we to make of this kind of power? I would think that it's important to note Facebook and Twitter, Microsoft as well, acting as states, acting more recently as though they have their own sets of governance below them. And this is something that is noticeable in Facebook setting up a committee, an independent oversight board, to serve as a sort of Supreme Court when it comes to what should be and should not be allowed on its platform. increasingly we're seeing these large corporations coming into a realm in which they can set their own legal frameworks and terms. And that is something that is definitely going to influence the political process on the regulation side, because they have all of the information they need regarding their own platforms, their own potential use. So they're able to enter into a very lopsided negotiation with regulatory bodies and with Washington, D.C. in particular. So they are essentially becoming their own states. And I don't think that that's an exaggeration when you think of the power of their financial structures. It is something that is a bit of a jump. Of course, they don't have the conventional military power of states. They don't have that kind of sway. But when you think of the amount of financial power that is loaded into them, you are beginning to see this sort of Hobbesian state emerging, where you have a representative in the form of the company of many, many different perspectives and opinions. That kind of collection of political opinion, of political perspectives, and also through the application of different AI technologies, the manipulation of those opinions to some extent, you're approaching something that is very new. And that's what I think strikes me most as a historian, is you are now actually entering into a world that has great power competition between large corporations. And so that's something that's very fascinating to me, and also a little worrying as somebody who likes individual power and individual rights and all of that. So let's take an interesting case. I know we've probably seen more than enough of him from one way or another. As happens with all politicians, there's an oversaturation around the time of hustings. But you see the kind of difference in opinion, and you can do this with pretty much any opinion with this particular politician, find contradictory pairings. So this isn't a great feat that I've achieved here by providing a positive view on social media. This idea that a billionaire couldn't reach his base, just had no way of getting to so many people at once without social media. He said this multiple times in interviews, describing how social media is a sort of burden for him, but he realizes that he would not be able to reach nearly as many people as he has over the course of the past 5 years. And then more recently, he's been just a little less bullish on the future of big technology. He is gone about shifting that because, in part, Facebook and Twitter have pushed back against some of the more outlandish claims that he's posted, trying to assert essentially that the opposition is big tech. Big tech's the enemy. So you can see how big tech is being bandied about, being shifted back and forth from the position of big friend and big donor, great relationships we have with libertarian Silicon Valley, to big tech being the problem. So I'm simply bringing this in to say that this is still a very fraught conversation. And it's very difficult to map the political fault lines in it right now when it comes to the regulation of Silicon Valley and the implementation of practical and meaningful protections for consumers. Now, I think it would help to bring in a little bit of Michel Foucault here, and I can hear a number of graduate seminars groaning when I bring in any Foucault, but at the same time, I think the conception of power and thinking of governmentality that is forwarded by a great deal of Foucault's work. And if you think of biopower in particular as being something that can be a useful tool in a toolkit here, I think it's something that can be applied to the way we think about the consumer's relationship to novel technologies and the governmental power of these technologies when it comes to ordering societies, when it comes to determining and defining categories within a given society. So we are not thinking of how a given entity is going to be conserving power to reinforce or strengthen the broader society. We're thinking about how a given entity is going to be condensing power, consolidating power into its own hands to strengthen itself. There is a difference here in how we are presenting our thoughts on power, especially when it comes to Silicon Valley corporations and their relationship with government institutions. They need to be treated, if you're going to have a meaningful discussion around regulation, as states unto themselves, in a sense. Not giving them the trappings of the state, not pulling up a seat at the table at international discussions, but treating them almost on equal terms and recognizing that they do have a great deal of power, because if we cannot grasp that, I don't think we'll be able to see the horizon of their power and understand what they can and cannot influence. Katzenbach and Ulbricht provide us with, I think, a very good summary, a very good map for how algorithmic governance systems are developing. And of course, this is a very recent trend. It's really only about 8 years old that AI has come into its own, what we call AI. And of course, there needs to be an asterisk there. This isn't the artificial intelligence of science fiction. It is really a description of incredibly advanced statistical techniques being applied in packaged ways, routinized, and the development of broader assumptions or determining broader findings on the basis of seemingly disparate data. Now, that still requires a great deal of packaging, and that still requires an interrogation right from the outset of what the purpose of that kind of categorization and automizing is. You have to go back to first assumptions. Otherwise, it's going to just be garbage in, garbage out. And I think that's something that Katzenbach and Ulbricht do very well in focusing on the spectrum of high transparency versus low transparency systems, and full automation on the right-hand side back down to a recommender system, a more controlled vision of algorithmic governance. So there can be some kind of mixed autonomy in these systems where a human can come in and check, and a human in this situation might be an entire democratic system can check to make sure that things like the distribution or assignment of entitlement payments, the distribution of policing resources, all of these things are done in a way that protects democratic institutions and has a meaningful human component to them. Not full automation, but a mix. And so I think that's a good idea of the spectrum that we're working with. Here again, bringing in a little film is Metropolis, a famous film of Fritz Lang, which contains a good deal of artificial intelligence imaginings. I won't spoil the plot for you, but it is a 1930s film, 1920s film actually, in which AI is developed in the form of a robot. And an automated city is essentially running amok. It's going out of control. So the idea, at least the vision of the potential of artificial intelligence has been long with us. And again, we need to, when we use that term, really rein that in and not conjure up images of robots in outer space, that kind of thing. It needs to be a little more grounded in thinking about the initial concerns that we might have with those technologies in relation to society. So I offer 5 categories by which we should think of algorithmic governance, or by which we can perhaps practically think of formulating an ethical system to govern these new technologies. First, you have to consider assumptions. That would contain all of the sorts of human biases that we carry with us when we're coding or when we're programming an autonomous system. Second, categories. Determining what something is, or determining what a person is by their demographic makeup, for instance, would be one of those categories. Determining that a particular person of a given racial or ethnic background is more likely to do X, Y, or Z, whatever those things are, is how those categories are defined. This is something that is perhaps going to be increasingly done in exchange with autonomous technologies. But for now, we are building those kinds of biases. We are building those kinds of categorizations into the technologies themselves. Processes, again, automation, if, then, whatever. Determining those outcomes from a legal or juridical standpoint, and determining what kind of information human moderators ultimately get to see in those processes. These are things that we need to take into consideration. Predictions, wild or otherwise, also given the potential of the technology to run amok, as it were, from that standpoint, where things are coming into being because the technology is predicting them and influencing it as we go along. And I think most important of all, thinking about relationships. Who is benefiting from that additional power? Who stands to gain, to quote a famous thinker of the 20th century, from these kinds of relationships? And why the systems are being put into place to autonomize or routinize given procedures. Those relationships, whether they're class relationships or race relationships or gender relationships, they need to be interrogated further before proceeding down that road. And I think that's perhaps a non-inclusive starting point for having that kind of conversation. Now, what is needed as well is that broader range of ethical systems, of ethical frameworks by which we can think of how we want our relationship with technology to unfold. Who do we want to be as a society? What do we prioritize? And what do we want to be as individuals? It is absolutely necessary to begin with ourselves as a starting point when we're dealing with these technologies and trying to think of new ethical frameworks by which to deal with them. We have to also consider what the future will think. And I think that Hans Jonas brings that into play in his thinking very well. When we're developing an ethical system, you have to think ahead in time. If you set up an algorithmic governance structure that will exist well beyond our lifetimes and will continue to grow, that is also something that needs to be considered. What will future generations think of us and our values? So just briefly going through a couple or a few options in terms of the future of regulation for algorithmic governance systems. We have the EU's GDPR passed in 2016, which is in a sense focused largely on individual rights, on protecting the rights of consumers. There are consumer relationships that are considered in its structures. It has the benefit of some degree of enforceability, which is something that is elusive when it comes to thinking about how to govern the internet, or how the internet should not be governing itself, rather. So we have a bundle of rights, and I think a rights-based discourse is, in spite of all of its limitations, a very good starting point for a broader discussion of how potential regulations will take a meaningful form in the law. And I think that the rights discourse of the 20th century is indeed an excellent starting point because it has universality. It considers the whole of human society. This idea, again, going back to Rousseau, of the social contract, of having these relationships, meaningful relationships, come into reality and be defined. So I think that despite the criticisms of something like the GDPR, it is a useful starting point to begin the conversation, to begin to think about how legal frameworks can grow up with emerging technologies and how algorithms are being used from a governmental standpoint. You also have a concept of maybe we can use market tools to rein in the greatest excesses of the larger tech companies. You can do that by, one, introducing new competition, which is somewhat difficult when you have monopolistic corporations. You can also create alternatives. And I think the Mozilla framework for that, some of you may use Mozilla or Firefox, then that is an interesting counterpoint to the idea of the large Silicon Valley corporation just, pulling an information suck or a data suck on its consumers. Additionally, the platform GoDaddy is another one that has been considered to be a competitor to traditional browsers like Safari and Chrome. But it remains to be seen how this kind of brand of ethicalness, this brand of having an ethical approach to things work. And I think the good case point to reference from that would be the fair trade movement of the last couple decades. It has had mixed results because if you're not true to that brand, if there isn't, a putting your dollars where your ethics are in everyday operations of that kind of brand, it can really ruin this kind of branding. So we have to think about digital rights. And we have to do that in a reverential way and thinking about historical context. We cannot let digital rights fail to keep pace with broader intellectual and political movements, like civil rights, for instance. We have a lot to learn from the civil rights movement of the 1960s in the United States and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa of the 1970s and 80s. These kinds of claimings of large bundles of rights for individuals and for whole groups bring into play an idea of collective rights, of entire groups, of entire groupings of people having their own positional rights in relation to the broader society. This is something that could be useful in thinking of how we want to navigate that space between individual rights and collective rights when it comes to digital rights. We also need to consider that in this great power play between China, perhaps Russia, and the United States, there are indeed other nations in the world that might need their individual seat at the table. I reference here the Badung Conference of 1955, which was the starting point for the non-aligned movement, simply to say that all across the global South, there are nations that contend with issues regarding AI and algorithmic governance in very different ways from this sort of Silicon Valley focused individual consumer rights basis of the global North, of Europe and the United States in particular. These nations might have different opinions regarding the need for algorithmic tools and how they would be used. They might have different practical considerations to take into play, to come into play in those discussions. Finally, there's the realm of universal rights, of thinking of digital rights in relationship to the whole enchilada, as it were. Thinking in terms of a broader statement of digital rights that can be used as a signpost, that may not be to the level of enforceability, but it creates a set of global norms upon which institutions can operate and with which they can interact in the long run. And here is Eleanor Roosevelt bringing out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. I think that there is some value in that, in spite of whatever the brand of the UN might have gone through over the past 70 years. I think those institutions, those kinds of dialogue, I think that's important, and it establishes a framework of international norms that we can all reference to. So let's consider very briefly, if old power likes new tech, then so does new power. And new tech has created its own kinds of phenomena. its own kinds of new power. And this is a very strange adventure that we're going on in terms of our relationship to new power. You might not always get what you want when you move toward the further democratization of these platforms. But I think that the further democratization of reality, of going beyond just the digital level of democratization that we need to advocate for, and thinking about power relationships in broader society, that is something that needs to happen first. It needs to be meaningful in a practical sense, to distribute that power across society. It wasn't something that was developed, these structures that we have, our constitutions, our norms, our legal systems, they were developed not just to empower people, but they were developed to restrain power itself and to keep those condensations of power from gaining too large a stranglehold or a foothold in any particular place or format. And on the other side of social media powered movements, of course, you have the other side of the political spectrum. This too is also something that needs to be considered. You cannot simply drop one side of the political spectrum and say these technologies are going to favor this bundle of political perspectives that we find palatable. You have to consider that there are real concerns and motivations behind the other side of the political spectrum, left or right. And we need to also, I think, reconsider whether there is such a thing as left or right or both sides of issues when we're dealing with information on the internet. So I just wanted to conclude with what I think is a very important quote from Steve Jobs in the 1990s. He was asked in an interview what he thought of the computer revolution, then only in a sort of infant stage by our standpoint, but something that had come quite a long way since the late 1970s. And he proposed that when he was a kid, he had read in a National Geographic magazine that the author had essentially compared different animals by their efficiency, how they efficiently use calories. And humans were blown away by cheetahs and panthers and lions, who really by far use their calories far more efficiently than humans do. But somebody had a good idea of putting the caloric usage of a human, that efficiency, on a bicycle. How efficient is a person with a bike? And the person on the bike just blows away the entire animal kingdom. That is the most efficient kind of usage of calories. And so he said that's what's remarkable to him about computers, is that they're bicycles for the mind. They are taking us to new places. They're enhancing our given potential as a society and as humanity. And my only concern here is that we're biking in circles right now with these new platforms. Those limitations, without addressing broader socioeconomic and political concerns, we may well be simply riding around in a circle. So we need to keep an eye on that destination from a human standpoint in our thinking on governing artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack, for this fantastic talk, really thought-provoking. And we actually have quite a number of questions on my list, and we will start with Professor Bakır.
Thank you, Merih. Thank you, Jack, for this very thought-provoking talk. I would like to share my reflections on what I heard from your very inspiring and interesting presentation. Artificial intelligence, big data, and big companies apparently and increasingly pose threat to liberal since I'm institutionalist, the question came to my mind was, how the institutions of algorithmic governance that would promote universal digital rights be constructed effectively. So you referred to EU general data protection regulation and fair trade, fair for life, and yes, there are a few other actions that were taken. But since we have apparently at the beginning of a long process, and I'm really curious how this process will evolve, because it requires, and effective institutions require shared understanding of the problems and their solutions. So this shared understanding issue is important in institutionalization process itself. In sense-making processes, very important. And this creating global norms in that respect is a very challenging and long process, and apparently we will see how things unfold in time. So I would like to hear your view on how would effective institutions reinforcing digital rights or universal digital rights in this governance process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And it is an important and very difficult one in a practical sense. I think from a theoretical standpoint, it's very easy to address it and say what we need first and foremost is to all be on the same page when it comes to our understanding of the technologies themselves. And I think that from a theoretical standpoint as well, what promotes that is dialogue between policymakers and industry. But that needs to be tempered by academic discussion, academic dialogue, having a meaningful impact, not just on setting the agenda for the policymakers themselves, but on having a real impact on societal thinking, how the broader society thinks and discusses these issues, thinks about and discusses these issues, is something that I think we've perhaps not emphasized enough in the academy, because it is so easy to completely realign with these tools, with the information-focused tools, an entire public's perspective on these issues. So it'd be impossible to get any meaningful legislation passed unless you have the public on your side and unless those institutions are functional. At the international level, I think a good starting point would be to have these kinds of running dialogues, these conversations that bring in civil society stakeholders, that bring in academic experts and scientists, along with current and retired policymakers, to get a sense of the broader roadmap, to understand how exactly to move forward with discussions of digital rights. It may very well be that this is something that a number of players don't think is workable in the long run. But I think having a discussion about it and mapping the terrain would be an important first starting point. So I know that's probably a very dissatisfying answer because there's no silver bullet. But I think just getting that conversation going in a meaningful way and getting everybody on the same page is a good place to start.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next I have Professor Arjan on my list. Zeynep Hocam, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, very quickly, Jack, thank you very much. It was a very inspiring talk, very enlightening. Just a quick question, actually, regarding your very last sentence, if you like, that we are cycling in circles. We are, I guess we are, like this community here, but somebody isn't. I mean, I don't think everybody is cycling in circles. I think somebody is, using a very fast car going to a place. Who are they and where are they going? That's my question.
I think that's a terrific question. And there are certainly some people who are, light years ahead of us on our little bikes right now. I think that you can see how just the amount of wealth that has been concentrated in these companies. I think that'll give you a sense of where it's gone and their internal corporate structures, which I think are also very problematic from the standpoint of, let's just take Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg, and I hate to just completely always be beating up on Mark Zuckerberg in my talks, but he's easy. It's just an easy reference point that everybody knows. He's both chairman of the board of Facebook and CEO, meaning he's his own, supervisor. He's his own governance structure. He's his own regulatory entity. I think that's somebody who's gaining. But then again, he's sort of in his own trap because he's responding to shareholders who are gaining. So in a sense, if you're in that system, if you're invested in Facebook, you are receiving returns on some level because their profits are always exceeding the mark. They're always gaining users, even though it's very difficult to verify that because they're the ones who tell us how many users they have. So you can see how it's so deeply ensconced in the broader system that it is very much benefiting shareholders in across the board. Another important phenomenon has been the rise of course, the Instagram influencer and people who have entire platforms on YouTube, and they're making what you might consider rather relatively small amounts of money off of that. So there's an entire economy and industry. You can't leave out the people who use Uber and Lyft and all of that. So it has broad benefits. I'm not going to lie, but it does have its ill effects when it comes to that level of governance and how those companies can very easily set agendas for entire nation states. So again, a mixed answer, but I hope a useful one.
Thank you very much. So we have Dr. Pelin Angın from Middle East Technical University on our list. Also, she happens to be one of our senior researchers at the lab.
Hi, Jack. Okay, sorry. So a long time no see. I think it was the last time I saw you was in Istanbul, probably. It was a great talk. Thank you very much. So I'm in the autonomous systems business myself, actually. Being a computer engineer, we do a lot of autonomous systems development. And also my focus is really cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is an aspect that needs to be brought in into AI, obviously. So oftentimes when we're developing these autonomous systems, we're just focusing on getting things done and trying to reach our target, maybe sometimes not really considering the things that could be the side effects that could result from the AI we're developing. So do you think, and actually, so because I'm in cybersecurity, I know that so even if you do not have ill will when you're developing these systems, there could be things what we call adversarial machine learning attacks on these systems. And no matter what you do, it's sometimes really difficult to defend against these attacks. So what I'm really wondering is, do you think AI could ever be held responsible for the outcomes of the decisions it makes? Or who is responsible for the decisions of AI in the end? Are you aware of any work along those directions? Thank you.
Sure. I think that, I mean, again, a very excellent question. In terms of responsibility, I think that's an area that we're going to have to evolve rather rapidly, our broader dialogue. Our terms need to almost shift on that. And perhaps it's something to do with distance from inception. So if you're really close to the creating point or the starting point of the technology, then perhaps the burden of responsibility is much, much higher, and it diminishes as that technology is being used. In terms of having AI held accountable itself, I think people have to be held accountable and should always be, but I understand the question is that you probably can't find one single person or one group, but you, again, will probably have to look toward who stands to benefit and who is gaining who is losing on the application of a given technology. In terms of work on that, I thought that Katzenbach's initial go at the broader ideas surrounding algorithmic governance is a good starting point. But again, I'm probably less familiar with it from a cybersecurity standpoint, so I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from the audience. Alp Yılmaz Çelenk, he sent his question to me.
Thank you.
Would you like me to read it, or would you rather ask it yourself?
Actually, I would rather to ask it myself.
Of course.
So you talked about Facebook and other social media platforms using their audience to promote their business. So what do you think about Donald Trump's previous election campaign on Facebook? And do you think it's ethical for his campaign staff to use Facebook as a tool for winning?
Personally, and again, I have to issue that disclaimer that I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody, least of all the administration of the United States. I don't think it's appropriate for this kind of technology to be used for political purposes. And I know that might dampen that kind of dialogue to some extent. But until you get the governance structure right, I think you have to be very careful, because you don't know what direction the companies are going to be leaning one way or another. It took an awful lot to get Twitter and subsequently Facebook to even put a little disclaimer on the tweets or on the Facebook posts of the president. Many of them are, some of them are inciting conflict between groups of people, issuing calls for basically, let's just, they're conspiracy theories in the main. And without any kind of meaningful regulation, it's hard to determine who then can be held accountable for that. In the United States, it's impossible to do a lot of that because of Section 230, which is essentially a legal framework that keeps the internet platforms from being accountable for what's shared on those platforms. And bizarrely, Trump is also arguing for rescinding that kind of protection. So I think from an ethics standpoint, it's unethical for us to allow politicians to use those platforms without any kind of considerations of restraint or accountability, because you can spread misinformation like a wildfire through the society. From a legal standpoint, it's very difficult to rein that in unless you start to add competition into the mix. You have to approach it at the level of institutions and address the companies themselves, because Twitter and Facebook and NBC News and Fox News have benefited from this election cycle and all campaigns. So I hesitate to look at the results from today's counting, so I might just stay with you all.
Okay, then we will continue with our questions. We have Tibet next on our list.
Yeah, hello. Firstly, thank you for the seminar. I think it was really interesting and enjoyable. So I would like to also ask a question in relation to the Cambridge Analytica case. So if we consider the extent of influence over human behavior with the use of like artificial intelligence, data, and algorithms, do you think it is possible to view fundamental democratic exercises, such as voting, the same way as we used to do? Or has the power shifted in this sense?
That's an excellent question again. And I'm going to just say, no, I think that democracy's fundamentally changed. But again, that's the perspective of somebody who's looking at the longer historical context of it. That's not to say we don't have reference points. That television changed the way democracy functioned fundamentally. That the communication of election results city to city via telegraph and telephone, that influenced those outcomes significantly. So democracy won't be the same again from that standpoint, but it can be something different. It can be something improved that takes into account how dramatically these platforms can be abused. That's perhaps just a little glimmer of light. And I think of what Yuval Noah Harari again writes on the subject, another historian, another perspective. His perspective on it is that these platforms could well spell the end of democracy as we know it, because you will then be manipulating the data so much that it's changing human behavior. And so that kind of almost hypnosis of that kind of concentrated power that can perform on a broader society, that's something that I find to be very dismal indeed. And I hope that we can find little alcoves, little alleyways in which democratic processes can take mental respite at the very least, and get away from that kind of chaos. It remains to be seen, but I do think the stakes are just as high as you've described. I think the process, the idea of liberal democracy is something that's at stake. And I'll just add one last point and then move on. I think thinking in terms of universality helps to counter that. Thinking about the entire society, thinking about what we want to be as human beings, first and foremost, what kinds of rights and expectations and responsibilities we should have as individuals. I think as long as we keep a good firm footing in the humanistic world, we won't lose sight of these larger problems.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next we have Patrick Brown on our list.
Hello. Again, thank you for the talk. It was very enlightening, kind of nice to follow. I had more of a question about one of your earlier points about big tech as kind of a state apparatus itself, because even in the discussions about Cambridge Analytica, about if we want to talk about state surveillance, what's going on in Xinjiang, the Patriot Act, these sorts of things, that I agree that large data can be used manipulatively to erode kind of personal freedoms. But at the same time, I still fail to see where it changes from a tool that campaigns, regimes will use to suppress, to try to get more votes, these things, and where it turns into its own sort of state apparatus, and how it's any different than moneyed interests, like you mentioned, from the JP Morgans, the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and things like that, that this is just the new version of that, for lack of a better word, the new bourgeoisie that's trying to influence the government to do things in its favor.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent question as well. Again, thinking of historical reference points, we've seen this before. We know how it works on some level. So to that extent, I think that's an excellent point and quite right. There isn't much of a difference between using that kind of a tool, this kind of a new tool, and using another one of the traditional tools, particularly regarding media. What my point, I think, was regarding their status as states, or approaching the level of the nation state is concerned, is that you need them to do certain functions, to perform certain functions. They're becoming like the gas, well, let's say the water in the tap. They're so essential that they are approaching at least the level of something like AT&T or General Electric, that kind of a large, almost monopolistic entity. When it comes to thinking about their role in democratic processes, however, you can, I think, see how they can be states unto themselves, in that they have entire governance systems set up for discussing, for instance, what kinds of content are permissible on the site. That kind of oversight board, they've even discussed at the level of Facebook, having a Supreme Court of sorts. And again, they're using the language of the state. It's something that's not being applied by analysts to it, but they're embracing the language of the state to simply say, we are the sort of global town square. and we need to be the deciders on what is and what isn't, harmful content or speech. And so what I'm saying is essentially, I can see them behaving more like that as time goes on, and having their own power bases that are separate somewhat from institutional governments as we know them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug.
Thanks. Now we have Deniz Ekinci on our list. Deniz, would you like me to ask the question you typed it already, or would you rather ask it yourself?
It doesn't matter, you can ask.
Okay, so first, thank you for the presentation. I think many firms controlling and leading ideas. However, I think they do not focus on climate change. I believe if the firms want to lead people in a good way, they can be an example, but why do you think they don't focus on this much? Or am I wrong?
I honestly think that from the standpoint, and again, I know Facebook and Twitter best, I think. From their perspective, they want to be seen as impartial as possible. And here again, I think that that's a good connection to the idea that they are adopting some of the ideas of the state. That they're not a corporation that is going to be setting the agenda. They're going to be the space in which agendas can be formulated. They're going to be this space in which discussion can occur. Their motto, at least at Facebook, was for a little bit of a time, I don't know if it is still, was join the conversation. So this emphasis on bringing people into the discussion comes along with the idea of being an impartial sort of referee. And I think this year has really shown them, Twitter and Facebook in particular, having to come in and blow the whistle a few times to keep political interests happy. And when I say political interests, I don't necessarily mean the insidious type of stuff, but that people were calling essentially for a little more refereeing and a little more control over the content. So I hope that answers the question, and just chime in if it didn't. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We have another question, and I will read it out loud. Do you think that AI can develop itself and get out of human control? And if it could, then what would be the possible risks that it can cause to large governments like the US or China, etc.?
I muted myself. I think it's the question that I'm not particularly well equipped to answer. It's an excellent question. I think Palin would be a better perspective on that. From just very, very briefly to say, I think some of the more outlandish statements regarding thinking about autonomous technology, they were defined largely by earlier 1950s style science fiction and very, very broad hypotheticals. I think there's a hypothesis, the gray goo hypothesis, that as you approach singularity with these technologies, eventually all life on Earth will just be reduced to carbon powering the mechanisms themselves. So that's not a future that I think is in the cards necessarily. But in terms of limited autonomy, I think, again, Palin would probably be the better person to answer it and have a more realistic perspective on it than a fanciful historian.
Pelin Hocam, would you like to react to that?
Well, yeah, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question either, but so actually I think it was like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had a long discussion with Merih and another friend of ours about this, and they were claiming that AI is gonna take control of the whole world, and I was saying no. But now, after these 5 years, I've started thinking that that might actually be true to some extent. I just think that the human in the loop should never be removed. So if we put the whole control in the AI's hands, things could get out of control. And that's why we're developing these human in the loop systems, actually. Human in the loop is the key, I believe.
And I couldn't agree more with that. And so thank you for bringing it up. And making sure I would say that the human in the loop is the most human possible. So a little plug for the humanities.
Thank you very much for keeping us in the loop. I remember that that heated debate that we had another friend who happens to be a biologist, by the way. So we had a biologist, a political economist like myself, and then a computer scientist on that table. And we were very much skeptical of usage of AI back then. The interesting thing is I think over the course of 5 years, we started getting closer to us in terms of our view on AI, as Helen is now more skeptical, I think, of it. And me and our friend now is maybe more aware of some potential usage of AI that can also benefit humanity. And so that's a more positive note, I guess, because we have, I think, 5 minutes left and we do not have any other questions on. No, we have a final question. Sorry about that. Lena Trabuco has a question.
No pressure being the final question. My question is, it's going back a little bit, but I wanted to maybe try to disentangle a little bit of this new power, old power kind of categories, and because they're still a little bit fuzzy to me. So you've completely convinced me. It doesn't take much convincing that these tech companies have adopted state-like features. And my background is in national security, so I fully think that like the state or old power needs new tech in this sense. That relationship is absolutely critical to the future of military technology. But my question is, how sustainable is this new power? At what point do you think that the interaction between old power or established institutions are going to complement or restrain sort of the astronomically increasing impact of tech companies? I think you're right that they're kind of setting this international agenda. They even are engaging in diplomacy. They have their own kind of foreign relations in some sense. So I'm wondering, at what point do you think old power will cap this as much as it can, or if they will, that relationship is too mutually beneficial that it'll just continue to grow?
Excellent question. I think that the companies themselves are now old power. They've gone to the level of that kind of institutional. They're the establishment, or as Americans used to say in the 60s, they're the man. And I think that that's something that they have gone to great lengths to both negotiate. I think of Nick Clegg, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats. He's working as basically the international relations officer for Facebook now. So if they're at the power where they can take the heads of political parties and have them as their sort of emissaries rather, I think that they have become old power themselves. And so perhaps the problem is power in itself, the power being consolidated or accumulated in any particular set of hands, regardless of whose hands they are. I think that's what so many of the institutions that the Enlightenment generated, whether it's good or bad, it did create a lot of systems to address power itself and to distribute power through societies, rather than retaining it, counterbalance power as much as possible. And so I think we're giving ourselves an awfully large blind spot if we don't think of checks and balances with regard to these large corporations, and if we don't have that kind of critical approach toward power itself, rather than it being some sort of victory. Okay, so now a new set of people are in charge. Again, a little bit of the 60s. It reminds me of what the Who said, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It's just the same kind of system replicating itself. So I think new power becomes old power rather quickly. just as the innovation of the garage in Silicon Valley becomes this big institutional edifice rather quickly, and that's not innovation anymore. So you got to keep rebelling in a sense and building that in.
Thank you very much. And it turns out it was not the last question, Lena, so pressure is off. I think we have time for one last question, and Aylin Yardımcı, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you for squishing my question as well into the presentation. It was extremely interesting to listen to the whole discussion, as I'm an outsider to this specific field of research, so not steal more of your time. My question will be in partial reference to an earlier concept you introduced in the beginning of your talk, namely digital rights. I wanted to ask where you think freedom of speech and thought could be located within this context. So the reason I'm asking this is that when one mentions digital rights these days, the first thing that comes to one's mind will probably be freedom from algorithms and being prey to them, especially after watching The Social Dilemma. So yeah, the first thing that would come to mind at this time would be freedom from algorithms, freedom from being a victim to make the big tech companies maximize their profits. But what I'm saying right now is mostly linked with the social media as a public utility view. So I come across many discussions in favor of seeing Twitter as a natural monopoly, because as it is in the case of Twitter, the highest degree of efficiency is reached under just one sole operator, which in this example happens to be Twitter. So when Twitter holds the monopoly over its policy on who gets heard and who doesn't, what classifies as fake news and what doesn't, how much space do you think there is in the current political climate to talk about digital freedom of speech?
That's a very good question. I think that it's difficult to think about digital freedom of speech when those concepts are applied as they are to some extent here in the United States to corporations themselves. And so I think our starting point is one that is so imbalanced when it comes to these discussions, where corporations are treated as people deriving from an old Supreme Court case. I believe it was the Southern Pacific Railroad versus Santa Clara County, USA in California, that determined that corporations have their own rights equivalent to individual people. The argument being, of course, that corporations are built up by people themselves. And you hear this often in corporate level discussions, that corporations represent people into themselves. So I think that it's hard to get to that point where those rights can't be more than just a referential, a document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, without countering and perhaps putting into the proper place the idea of the corporation, that the corporation's right to speech has different dynamics to it. It functions differently than the right of an individual to speech. So it's kind of a negative answer in the sense that you have to restrain other aspects of the rights dialogue, meaning they've taken too many rights for themselves. So like a piñata, we have to kind of crack it open and get those rights back. I don't think that that's a complete analysis. I don't think that that goes far enough. But I do think that talking about it in a universal sense, what are we all in terms of our relationship to our society and our relationship to these technologies, that's the kind of dialogue that I think needs to start around those rights, and that mapping needs to occur rather quickly. But it's going to be a long process and a fraught process, and I'm trying to not make as many prejudgments as possible as I explore these topics further. But that's just about it from my perspective on that. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Jack. This was an excellent seminar, and we all certainly benefited a lot from it. I hope I did not miss any questions. If I did, please feel free to email Jack, and I hope that he will be able to answer your questions. And also, if you would like to rewatch the seminar, you can send an email to me, so our team will share the recording with you. On that note, I think we are going to conclude the seminar for today, and our next seminar is going to take place on November 19th, so mark your calendars. We are going to have Akın Ünvar from Kadir Has University, and then the following seminar is going to be on December 3rd. We will have further information on it, and we'll share it with you soon. Thank you very much again to you all for attending the seminar and for this really fruitful debate we had. On that note, I think I also thank Caner Hocam for hosting us.
Thank you all. Thank you for initiating this wonderful event. Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to the follow-up events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and wishing a nice rest of the week to you all. I will stop.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.